and just say, welcome everyone once again. And I am going to drop into the chat 4 documents that we're going to be looking at today. So I'm going to do that now so that you'll all have access to them. And these are things that you probably already have, but we're going to be talking through them a little bit. So it'll just be handy if you're able to have those with you. So the first one is the memo from 2018 concerning observation. Then the second one that I'm going to add is going to be the one for adding and removing related services. And then I'm also going to add a couple of resources that Helen and I created that we thought would be helpful for districts to utilize for Section 7 and helping staff really understand the differences between SDI, accommodations, and so forth. So we also created an activity to go along with that. So we're gonna talk through some of that today because we've gotten some additional questions and we wanted to be able to share these with you, and then also ensure that you're able to take these back and utilize these with your staff. So hopefully everyone has access to them. I've popped them all into the chat. Let me know if you see them.
Dee Dee, I see them in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Helen. All right. So Helen, why don't you take us through what we're going to talk about today?
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I had myself unmuted when I was coughing and then I muted myself. So I apologize when I was supposed to be talking. So today's topics are, you've already had a little brief overview from Dee Dee, adding or removing a related service from after the ETR is complete. And we have the 2015 ODE memo, observation, definition and allowance, ODE memo from 2018, Section 7, and we have, like Dee Dee was saying, some resources for linkages for SDI, talking more about accommodations and assistive technology, talking a little more about where Helen used to say it's not a hill to die on. It's not a hill to die on, but we're trying to get them in the right place. Missing service delivery minutes due to staffing shortages. And I know we've had a lot of questions on those concerns.
Perfect. Thanks, Helen. Okay, so the first question is, what is required when there is a suspicion for a related service area after an ETR has already been completed? And it doesn't matter how long after the ETR, if it's 6 months or if it's a year and a half. And what everyone always, we always refer back to is the OEC memo, and you've got it in the chat so you can open it up and look at it. But there's the main crux of the content is that you do not have to do a full reevaluation. We assume that everyone knows this, but it's always worth repeating because we are always startled at how many folks are actually confused around this. There is no such thing as an amendment for an ETR. The amendment applies only to the IEP. It's not allowable, it's not legal, does not exist. You cannot amend an ETR. So this is sort of the workaround, if you will, the allowance from the state, because typically if you've got to add something or you need to make a change to the ETR, you have to do a full new reevaluation or a record review with additional testing as warranted. In this case, there is an allowance that you do not have to go back and do a full reeval unless the team believes that is needed. And if you have, multiple areas that you have additional concerns about, or there's new information that's come to light, then you may need to do that. And you certainly would be, right and correct in moving forward with that. But if it's a simple case of, we've done the ETR and something's popped up later, there's a fine motor concern or a gross motor concern or whatever the case may be that just wasn't there before, then you do have the ability to only evaluate for that area. So what you have to do, and I took this right from the memo, is you have to follow the same process that you would for a regular evaluation. So you've got to give the parent notice. You have to do the planning form, and obviously you're only going to check the area that you're going to assess. Make sure you have informed consent, so the parent signs the planning form, and then also make sure that you have that meeting to determine eligibility, get a signature, and then you have to provide the parent with a copy of the ETR like you do in any case. So then the question often becomes for us, well, then what? Do we print the entire ETR as a whole? And the short answer for that, what we like to say, oops, sorry, I went backwards instead of forwards there. And I already said this, that you can decide whether you're doing a full reeval or just in that area. But again, what you need is PR01, the planning form, consent signed, eligibility signatures. And then what I suggest you do is staple those together and then simply put that with the full ETR. You don't want to redo the whole ETR, and you don't want to make it seem as though that was part of the initial or the recent ETR, because it wasn't. It was something that occurred later. So we want to make that clear, and that's okay because that's allowed and you have the ability to do that. So just like you would for an IEP, if you've got an amendment, you're usually going to have the amendment, it's going to be right on the front so you can see what was different. And the same is true for the ETR. You're just going to have that in the file with the other ETR. You can paperclip them together or whatever you need to do. But again, we don't want to try to make it appear that it was all happening at one time. We want to make sure that it's clear that there was a distinction between the recent evaluation that took place and then, oh, this is something that popped up later. We followed, the correct process, and we've added an area of eligibility. And then obviously, if the team determines that services are warranted, then it's on the IEP team at that point to add a related service to the IEP. And you're going to do that through the simple amendment process. So the only other thing that I would say is, and I talked about this a little bit already, when you're making that decision as to whether or not you need to do a full reeval, or you've got enough information and you're going to do some assessing to support that, is that I would definitely say make sure you've got some documented lack of progress in the curriculum, and you are basing that on the data that you've got. So you've got some evidence to support that this is happening, and then obviously you're moving forward with whatever assessments you need to.
Edie, while you're on the subject of whoops, sorry. Now can they hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Again.
You're good, Helen.
Oh, okay. Quite honestly, while you're on this, since we've had from a couple districts similar questions on removing a service.
Great, thanks, Helen. That's a great point. So it's a little different when you talk about removing a service. If it is removing a related service, then the same memo that we use as our guidance is still in effect. So you are literally going to follow the exact same process that I just talked through, from every step, from notifying the parent, going through the planning with the parent, all of that, getting consent, and all of that, and your eligibility. The difference being that you are going to have, probably you should, you better, substantially more data and information that serves as your evidence and your justification for why a student no longer needs that related service. And that's a good thing. The fact is, and we need to make sure that we're explaining it that way. When a child has made so much progress that they no longer need that specialized service, that's something to celebrate. But you need to have thorough and accurate data and documentation to support that. And you very likely may still need to do an assessment. So you've got, that testing protocol that then supports the data that you've gathered as a team, that then supports that decision that the child is no longer eligible. So you're just literally doing the same exact thing. You're just sort of doing it for the reverse reason. Now, having said that, that's for a related service. That's wholly and completely different than making a determination that a child no longer needs specially designed instruction and removing eligibility for special services. That cannot be done in a simple process and requires a complete, full reevaluation. Just want to make that clear because I don't want to send the wrong message to anyone.
Yeah,
So,
most of our questions have been about related services. So
right. Okay, thanks, Helen. Any questions about any of that we just talked about? Okay, well then we will keep going. This is sort of a hot topic right now. What constitutes an observation according to OEC? And again, I'm saying, let's look at that memo. That's our guidance from 2018. So you guys have that so you can pull it up, but I'm gonna show you just a few snippets of language from it. Oops, sorry. Guess I popped off there. So if you recall, and if you're looking at the memo, you see that there was an allowance, sort of a caveat, if you will, that OEC provided that said that every time you were doing a reevaluation, you did not have to have, quote unquote, a formal observation that's timed, where someone specifically goes into a setting, lays eyes on the child, marks down with a tally sheet, and anecdotal records, what they saw, what they observed, what they heard. That if you had current, meaning it occurred within 1 year, if you had current information based on teacher or other educators' anecdotal records that could address the student's needs and the suspicion of disability in the area of the suspicion, that you could use that. I will tell you, this memo, as of right now, is still in effect, but they are looking at this at the state, and they do intend to revamp this. And I do anticipate some walk back of this, and I will tell you why. And I know this is upsetting for many folks, but here's why. What we have seen in the past several years since this allowance went out is that we repeatedly see notes in a part 1 from a teacher marked as observation, but what it really is a bare minimum record of their progress in the general curriculum. It's not even an observation. And so what OEC has continued to say is, question?
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Did you have a question or input?
No, I had a kiddo about to grab something and I had to use a teacher voice.
Okay, okay, that's okay. Happens all the time, we understand. So what OEC has continued to say is this, is the purpose of the observation is to support with evidence in the area that we suspect the disability, that we saw something, we were able to see that this happened, we're able to have some input that is more comprehensive than just a couple of words or sentences. And what we are seeing a lot of is the school psych gives a teacher a questionnaire or a survey, and they're answering with a phrase or two or a sentence or two. Things like Susie comes to class with her, with her materials. Susie comes with, all of her folders and her pens and pencils and is quiet in class. And that's not really addressing the area that we're looking at. So that is not sufficient. And so if you are relying on anecdotal notes or records from a teacher from within a year, they need to be comprehensive. They need to give meaningful information about the area of suspected disability, how it impacts the student, and what that manifests like. So what does it look like when Susie has reading difficulty, or when Susie has difficulty processing information and performing math calculation? Like, what does that look like and manifest itself as? So that's very different than just I hate to use the word fluff, but we see a lot of that in these supposed observations where it's literally just, Susie's nice and gets along with peers. So that is the reason that I anticipate maybe some walk back to a more stringent definition of what constitutes an observation, because we've had that so misused and misinterpreted over the past couple of years. But again, as of today, that memo is still in effect. So you can still use those anecdotal notes and records from a teacher, but again, they've got to be within 1 year, and just be really careful that your folks in the district understand that it needs to be meaningful information instead of just, fluff and a few sentences. It's got to capture what's happening for the student in that area of suspected disability. Helen, anything to add there?
Whoops, no, but we have Rachel here. I don't know if she would like to add anything. Rachel says no. Okay, so I think we're good to go, Dee Dee.
All right. Okay,
so do you want me to take this slide?
Yep. Go ahead, Helen.
Well, I'm going to take it only because I'm the person that says it's not a hill to die on when it comes to assistive technology, or I've said that in the past. So it says, can you provide additional clarification around section 7, which we know section 7 is more, it's SDI, it's accommodations and assistive technology. And in the past, let's say past 3 to 4 years, well, no, wait, in the past longer than that, I've kind of always said, oh, it's not a hill to die on. And don't worry if you're not in a review, but in the review, they do look at this whole construct of the IEP, but they are getting a little pickier about assistive tech and accommodations. They will make comments, but they won't always say, no, you have to correct that. But going forward, we're going to talk more about why you should put things in assistive tech that are assistive tech, and why certain things that you might put in SDI are really accommodations, and you have to talk about the teaching level in SDI. For example, what I want to say for assistive tech is if the student has something as an accommodation, but it's not just written, and we mean low tech too, in assistive tech, if they go somewhere else, or someone may not know that they absolutely need that every day. So that's why we are shoring up what we say in assistive tech, and Helen is moving away from it's not a hill to die on. So since Dee Dee has kind of coached Helen on that, I'm going to let Dee Dee take the next slide.
Thanks, Helen. I love that. It's not, we're rolling down that hill now, right? That's what we're doing, or climbing
Yes,
up
we
the
are.
hill. I don't know, but so Helen makes such a good point. It's not about dinging or, being overly picky about making sure something's in the right box. The real reason that we want to capture things correctly is so that it actually makes sense for the services for the student, because we want to see that nice chain of linkage between the instruction from the teacher, the environmental accommodations, and then the assistive technology that's provided. Or the same would be true if it was modifications instead of accommodations. So this is a tool that we created, and you may have seen this if you were with us for internal monitoring. We did share this with our new teams and our returning teams. But again, we've had requests to talk through this. So we're just kind of showing you, this is a one-page handout that you can share with your staff. And it's something that, hopefully would be helpful for them to get a clearer picture in their mind. And again, this also was dropped into the chat. So you should have access to look at the full document. But this is just a visual of the circle that it makes, the linkage. So we start with the goal, which is the skill or the behavior that is to be taught. Then we have the SDI, and that is the strategies and methodologies used to teach the skill. And we always say the hint word in here is instruction. So if it isn't something that the teacher is doing, if it isn't an action, then it's not SDI. If it's a thing, then it's not SDI, because SDI is instruction, which means it's a verb. So anything that goes in there is a verb. That leads to the accommodations. Accommodations are those environmental supports that the student needs to be able to achieve the goal. So that's not the instruction. That's something we put in place in the environment, and the environment would include the task. So that's something that we put in place in the task that they're doing, like we reduce the number of problems, that's an environmental support, or we move where the child sits, or we, remove distraction by removing, pictures on the wall, or whatever the case may be. Those are environmental supports that we put in place. Obviously, modification is where we make that fundamental change to the scope and complexity of the curriculum. So generally, modification is going to take the place of accommodation, but we're still looking for that same nice flow and linkage. And then that leads us to the assistive technology, which is that physical item or software that provides or improves the student's access to instruction, or provides instruction for the adults in order to use the assistive technology with the child. So that is something tangible. So assistive technology is not SDI, it is a tangible something that we can see, taste, touch, smell, or it's the instruction and the use of the tangible something for the adults. Okay, so here is again, another visual to show that nice linkage. So when we think about the SDI, that's the how something is taught to the student. And you see these red keywords that we want you to think about. And really, I probably should have put instruction in red, because again, instruction is a verb. It's the what you're doing. Instructing is the verb. So it's the how. Then that links to the accommodation. What are the changes you're making to the environment or the task for the student? And then that leads us to the assistive tech, which is that tangible something given to the student. So here's some examples of what that might look like in an IEP. Whole and small group instruction in writing to include, now notice, these are all verbs, they're actions. It includes pre-teaching vocabulary, guided practice in use of a graphic organizer and checklist, modeling, corrective feedback, and prompting. Those are all actions that the teacher takes, not the graphic organizer. The organizer cannot teach anything on its own. It can't do anything on its own, but lay on a table. So it's the action of the teacher, the teaching. Now we move to accommodations. So we know that the student has a need in the area of writing. So we know that they need this specially designed instruction. So what else might they need as an accommodation to the environment or to the assignment itself? So we're going to look at extended time, how much, twice that of peers, seating in close proximity to the teacher, frequent breaks. We've identified how often, how many, and we're saying that those writing assignments are reduced by 50%. Now we need to look at assistive tech. So what does the student need in terms of a tangible something that's going to help the student achieve the goal that they have in writing? So we think about things like a word bank. Now we talk about that graphic organizer because it's the tangible something that is going to allow the student to make that progress. Checklists, adaptive pencil grips, spell check, computer or tablet for typing assignments longer than 3 sentences. So hopefully you can see how really defining in a better, more concrete way what goes where helps you actually make it more meaningful for the student. Because what we often see is sort of that laundry list of, every possible accommodation, things that don't really make sense for the goal. And so if we think about this, we're thinking about the goal that the student has for whatever it is in writing. And now we can see how the SDI would really support that. The accommodations support what's happening in the SDI, and then that assistive tech supports the student and supports the accommodations and the SDI. So they all work together.
Dee Dee,
Anything-
sorry. I was just going to say, I think that visual is great for teachers because I think sometimes that is difficult to understand. And like I said, it's not about dinging you on the IEP or anything, but I think often people don't think about the low tech or they still, want to put it under accommodations. But I think just the visual and making it understandable that I think this will help teachers in even seeing exactly what they're doing. And I really think this, this organizer would be great for parents too, but definitely for teachers. I think there's something in the chat. Let me look. Can you put it in the chat again so I can share it with my staff?
I can't drop it in while I'm presenting, but as soon as I stop the recording, when we're done, I'll go ahead and put everything in the chat again for you. So yeah, such a good point, Helen. And that's really why we created this, because Helen and I thought that this would be a nice visual 1-page thing that a teacher can have on hand to, again, refer back to time and time again to really help them make that distinction when it starts to get muddy and they're thinking, is that an accommodation or is that the SDI? Because when you're writing a lot of IEPs, everything starts to run together after a while. So again, we thought this was a really nice visual to give them that additional support. So thanks for mentioning that, Helen. The other thing that we put together that we thought might be helpful for you to use with your staff during a staff meeting or a PD day or something is this very short activity that gives them a little bit of practice in putting this into application. So this is, again, a 1-page handout that can go along with that linkage chart. So the top of it is just going to be this little scenario of here's our pretend student, and they've got a little bit of basic info there. And then, oh, sorry, I think I went back instead of forward. All right, so we've got Damien. And then we have a little bit of information about, what Damien should be able to do in reading according to the standard, what that grade level expectation is, his current performance. Then we see what the IEP goal is. Then we're going to look at, okay, what's it going to take to get Damien to reach that goal? We think about the SDI. So the next step that we want to ask teachers to do is we want them to use that info that we just looked at and pull out what some of Damien's strengths were and some of his needs, and then think about what methods and strategies they would use to teach that skill. And that again is to really prompt them to use verbs. SDI is an action, it's instruction, it's a verb. So that will prompt them to start thinking about that. What are the strategies and methodologies that I would use to teach that skill for Damien? Once they've done that, then we kind of have a way to put it all together. So we go back to our visual to list the SDI, then think about what might we need to do in the environment for Damien to support his acquisition of that goal and capture that. And then, is there anything in assistive technology, low tech or high tech, that would provide him greater access to the curriculum and help him achieve that goal? And we want to capture that. Once the teachers have gone through this and they've captured all of their thoughts, then we have this that just can, again, be an example. This is not an exhaustive list, and they may have come up with lots of different items, but this is just, again, to sort of talk through it together. So some of the strengths that we identified were he had good listening comprehension, he wholeheartedly attempted his work, he was able to comprehend at a 3.8 grade reading level, and he could also make predictions at that same level. So then when we thought about what he needed, we recognized that he needed a proper reading assessment to identify areas of weakness that were more specific. He did need targeted interventions based on results. He definitely needed to acquire grade level vocabulary, and he needed to be able to use supports more independently. So then we thought about, well, what will it take to get him there? What strategies and methodologies could we as teachers use? Well, we could pre-teach vocabulary, targeted intervention strategies, so morphemic and contextual analysis, helping him recognize those context clues. We could model comprehension strategies, so we could teach him and show him how to use scanning and metacognition. Model use of a visual strategy sheet, provide that corrective feedback, and then obviously small group instruction in the gen ed setting or in a separate room with the IS. Now you'll notice the things that we have circled in red are the things that could be a hint for us about what we may need to list in assistive tech. We said we need to pre-teach vocabulary. Well, does it make sense that he would be given a vocabulary list or a word bank? Does it make sense that if we're going to model the use of a visual strategy sheet, then it makes sense that he would need that visual strategy sheet as one of the pieces of assistive technology. Think back to the example that we had earlier for writing. And one of the things that we shared with the internal monitoring folks was, if you think about a writing goal, again, we so often see graphic organizer is put under the SDI. Well, that's not instruction. That's a piece of equipment, if you will. It doesn't matter that it's low tech, it's still a piece of equipment. But not only the graphic organizer, well, what about the word bank or the editing checklist? Or, and I don't teach writing anymore, so somebody had to remind me what it stands for, but the COPS, little visual for, and I'm sure you all probably know what I'm talking about, a little visual for cups to help remind and prompt the student to take the 4 steps for, editing their writing. Those would be the pieces of assistive technology. They're not digital, they're not electronic, they're all pieces of paper, but they are still a tangible something that we give to the student. So hopefully that makes things a little clearer and will help unmuddy those waters a little bit. And then here were a couple of additional questions that we received around this. And again, just to help provide some clarity. So I think we've answered the first one. Does a graphic organizer go under accommodations and assistive tech? No, it doesn't need to. It's not an accommodation. That's not something done to the environment or the task. It is the tangible something you give to the student to help them. It's only assistive technology. Is it a major deal if you put it in both places? This is where Helen's absolutely right. If you've got it in both places, that's not a hill to die on. But again, we want to get in the habit of making things cleaner and clearer so that we're making the service delivery more meaningful and more directly aligned to the goal itself. So if you've got it in both places, that's okay. But again, our goal is to just streamline things to make it more meaningful. Should things be listed twice? No, no need to. What if students do not always want to use the assistive supports? We get asked this a lot, and I know Helen will chime in here as well. This especially happens for our middle school, high school kids. They don't always want to use the assistive supports. We can't force them to. We can offer them and provide them. And what I would say is, if you have a student who's being really resistant to a support, it's really important to have private conversation with the student and see what the student would feel comfortable with and try to come up with a system or a way that you can provide supports that are much more discreet. 9 times out of 10, when our older students don't want to use a support, it's because they don't want to be embarrassed in front of their peers and they don't want to be singled out as being different. So having a conversation and doing some brainstorming about how to make those things more discreet for the student is usually the way to get around that. And I'm going to ask Helen to jump in with anything she wants to add.
Basically, I was going to say absolutely, because having been a secondary level teacher, there are definitely times that students don't want to use the assistive supports. The only thing I would say in addition to that is I would document somewhere if we are not getting them. Like Dee Dee said, I would certainly have a discussion with the student privately and see if there was something we could come up with that they would more readily use or whatever. But I would document that the student is not using the assistive support, that they're refusing. So you have some documentation if a parent would come back and say, hey, I know my son or daughter hasn't used the support all year or, for months or whatever.
Perfect, Helen. That was actually the next thing I was going to say was absolutely, you need to make that documented, and I would do it in the progress report. So if the student's not using something, when you're writing that progress report, I would throw it in there so that, again, you're covered and it's clear that that's being provided and encouraged, but the student is opting not to do it. So perfect. And then this one might be confusing, but I know what they're asking, so we'll talk through it. So we were asked, and we get this often, so what do we have to list a one-on-one device, say a tablet for a student, since every kiddo in our district has a tablet, but the student doesn't necessarily need the one-on-one device? Then no, if they don't need it, here is what determines if you need to list it in assistive technology. Because we hear this a lot too, even around specially designed instruction. So it's not just for assistive tech, whether we're talking about SDI, accommodations, or assistive tech. If you've got a rock star teacher who differentiates for everybody in the class and is using UDL, that's awesome. But the question the team has to ask is, does Susie need this particular type of SDI, this accommodation, this assistive technology? Does she require it in order to access the general curriculum and make progress, even if it's freely given to everybody? What would happen if Susie moved to a different classroom or a different district where that was not provided to everybody automatically? Would she require it? If the answer is yes, then you have to list it in section 7, even if you're giving it to every kid in your district. So if everybody gets a tablet, but Susie has to have a tablet, then you need to list it. The opposite is also true. If you give every kid in your district an iPad and Susie doesn't require that, it's just a benefit, then you do not need to list it. What you are listing is what the student has to have in order to access and make progress in the general curriculum. So hopefully that clears that up. And then finally, we've been asked this quite a bit. We've had this happen. If you've been on any of our internal monitoring or some of our other things, Helen and I have talked about, we've had districts in our region who have found themselves with a FAPE violation. We know that there is a struggle to provide service delivery minutes right now, especially with the staff shortages. So we've had a lot of questions come up about what to do. How do we handle that?
So I'll just add, besides
Go ahead,
staff,
Helen.
I'm just going to add, besides staff, we've had a lot with related services.
Yes.
And not being able to get a speech therapist and not being able to find one anywhere around. This is and I'll let Dee Dee go ahead and talk, but especially with related services. I mean, for staff too, but related services have been popping up.
Yeah, such a good point, Helen. It's across the board. If you look at this chart, you see that the educator shortages last school year were overwhelmingly higher, and the majority of those were in special ed and subs, and those were where we were hit the hardest and are continuing to be hit the hardest. So you know, our math, science, and then again, as Helen said, SLPs was lower, but we know that this year that has increased. And we also know that OTs and PTs, we've had real struggles with those folks as well. We also know that right now, last year and this year, many of you have found yourself in the position where you are reassigning staff. Some folks have had to combine classes or have had to change student schedules because of staffing shortages. And we know that. And we know that will likely continue in the near future. What we want to bring up is just, we want to make you aware that when you're in those situations, and most of you are right now, there is definitely the increased potential for a FAPE violation. We have had several within our region. We've had quite a few across the state. And not because folks were dropping the ball or being negligent. It has literally most every instance has been a result of a critical shortage, and you know, minutes were missed and folks weren't aware that it was happening until it was too late, and it got brought up by a parent, and then it was found to be a FAPE violation. So what we want you to think about in terms of how do you avoid that is just taking a look and making sure that you've got measures in place that are allowing you to really closely monitor your service delivery. And we're kind of saying we're using the acronym from first aid, the AAA, assess, alert, attend. So we want to make sure that you've got multiple methods for all staff, and that may include your non-certified or your non-credentialed staff as well, to observe, track, and quantify services, making sure that you've got, a mechanism for doing that, for reporting and monitoring that. So that's the assess. And then the alert is make sure that everyone knows what and when and how to report any lapse in service. So because in some of the cases where we've had FAPE violations, it was a related service person or a teacher recognized that, yeah, well, we weren't able to give those minutes because, we didn't have staff. We had this student moved around, blah, blah, blah. But then no one in the administration knew about it, and therefore no action was taken. So make sure that everyone is clear to report immediately when there's a lapse in service. And this is also critical. The alert is also your responsibility as the district to alert the parent. Don't wait for the parent to come to you and complain or file a complaint with ODE because there's been a lapse in service. Be proactive and inform the parent and tell the parent, this is what's going on, and then here's what we're going to do to correct it. And that's the attend part. Address missing services right away. You're going to have to maybe amend the IEP. Obviously, you're doing a PRO1. And then as a team, you need to determine if compensatory services are necessary. They might not be. There are times when they might not be, but probably the majority of the time, you're going to be looking at some type of compensatory services, and then you can make a plan for that. And so then, and here's the thing, if there's been a lapse in service delivery and you take the proactive approach where you've alerted the parents, you've addressed it, you've made a plan, guess what? It's not a FAPE violation. This was an issue, this happened, we're aware, we're on top of it, we're correcting it. When you don't do that and it gets reported, that is a FAPE violation. I guess technically under the letter of the law, when there's a lapse in service, it's a FAPE violation. But what I'm saying is that when you take a proactive approach and you're on top of it, you're in a whole lot better shape. You're not going to be looking at, any kind of corrective actions and all of the things that come along with a FAPE violation once it gets to the level of, ODE. So we just want you again to have have a plan in place in your district. So, and the most important part of that is having a process to check in on service delivery, report any concerns that teachers are having or your related service folks are having, and have some method for tracking. It doesn't matter if you do that during a staff meeting that everybody just does a quick, whip around with where you are with students and their delivery minutes. You can do it high tech, you can use tracking through Google or, Excel or anything that you want. If you have, roundtable at your TBTs where your teacher teams are looking at the students on their caseload and using an informal checklist. It doesn't matter how you do it. What's important is that you do it. All right, I have been talking a lot. And thank you for hanging in there. I'm going to pause. I'm going to let Helen add anything that she wants to, and I'm going to pause for questions that you may have or input that you may have around anything that we've talked about.
And I'm just going to say, I think you covered most of it, Dee Dee. I think possibly we will have some questions. And next month, 4/20, we will be on in the morning. For everyone out there, we try to flip months. So we have morning office hours one month, and then we'll flip to afternoon hours the next month. And before we go, naturally, we're going to take questions, but we want to say, have a happy spring break. Everybody deserves one. So I will go ahead and see if people have questions, and then we will ask if people have questions, but they want the recording turned off. Okay, how long until the recording is loaded into the website? Dee Dee,
Good
what is
question.
that's usually
Yeah,
day?
it's usually a couple of days. I will format the recording, and then I will send it off to Heidi, one of our colleagues at the office, and she will get it on our YouTube channel and on the website. So I would say usually we've got it up there within two days, usually 3 at the most.
Thanks, Abby.
I have a question. This is Erin.
Hi, Erin. Go
It's
ahead.
about the last thing we were talking about with the related services minutes. If
Mhm.
the reason the student's not getting the minutes is because of student absences, we just always document like their absences. Is that okay, or are we supposed to be making if they? I mean, we just had a student who was here 10 days for the entire grading period.
Yep.
So
No.
therapy, documents. We tried to see them, but they were absent. We tried to see them, they were absent. We tried to see them, but they were absent. Is that what we're supposed to be doing?
Yeah, that's right, Erin. When we talk about lapses in service delivery, we are talking about it's our fault as the
Right.
adults, as the educators, not because the student is not there. That's completely different. That is not a FAPE violation. And no, you do not have to, obviously, you're trying, you're doing your due diligence. And when you've got a case where a student is absent, the only thing that we would say is, making sure that you've got an absence intervention team that is functioning in the district and is doing what it's supposed to do to try to engage those students with chronic absenteeism. But no, you're doing exactly what you need to.
And Erin, I know you know this, but the only caveat to that would be if a student was on, like it was a medical situation and they were going to be out for a certain amount of time or home instruction, and then you would have to work around those minutes.
Ours are almost always medical absence.
Medical absences.
Probably 99% are for medical reasons.
Okay, Dee Dee, jump
Yeah,
in here
so-
too, because.
So Helen's right. If it's due to medical reasons, then again, you are, that's not a FAPE violation.
It's
You
not
are-
a FAPE violation.
Right,
but-
it's not a FAPE violation, and you are not on the hook, so to speak, to make those up. However, Helen's right. If there's a situation where a student is medically fragile, and obviously for your population that you serve, we know that that's pretty common for you. What you do need to do is, as a team, you need to determine if the student requires home instruction. If they're not coming because they're not able to medically, then you need to right away have that conversation in that meeting about, do you need to have home instruction so that they do have access to the curriculum and they have all the supports that they need? And do they need those related services and that SCI and everything provided at home?
Yeah, and once again, Erin, your situation is quite different than
Yeah.
the district situations when a student has a long-term absence and is at home, and you go into the process of setting up home instruction.
Most of ours, for the students who would be missing that much time, they wouldn't be allowed to see them on the unit anyway.
Right, that's what I was thinking,
So it's
going back to
yeah.
what happened when COVID when we first shut
Yes.
down.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
you're in a
exactly, Erin.
unique situation.
Yeah, and Helen, that's such a good point. If you recall, Erin, we had a lot of conversation with you guys about that when COVID happened, and you would really treat it the same way. So that might mean an amendment to the IEP. If the student isn't able to come and they can't receive home instruction because they're so medically fragile, then you just want to amend the IEP to reflect that we're
Right.
pausing, and that services will resume when there's a medical release for the student and it's safe to do so. So you just want to make sure, and a PR01, obviously. So it goes back to that documentation of just carefully documenting that, exactly what the situation is, what's happening, and why service delivery isn't happening.
Thank you both.
Certainly. Any other questions? Does anybody have a question that they want us to turn off the recording for? Okay, I'm not hearing any, or I don't see anything in the chat saying yes, turn off the recording. So I kind of, oh, I thought I heard somebody.
I think that was just me unmuting Helen.
Okay, well, Dee Dee has a question. No, well, once again, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and please send us questions that you have. We try to pick what we are getting the majority of questions around. But once again, thank you for being here. See you next time in the AM, and enjoy happy spring break.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dee.